class, I thought I would give you a short video on the communication process. You can find this information in your textbook, but I thought this video would be most helpful for you for many reasons, but in particular for you as a professional student and someone who's learning about business and professional communication, and also for the assessment in this module. So let's get started. First, I want to say a couple things about communication. I'm sure you read the chapter, but I want to remind you that communication is a tool. It's something that we use, obviously, to inform, to persuade. But, sometimes this tool can be used for good or it could be used for bad. Communication is irreversible. Once something is said, once a source has communicated a message, information, and the receiver receives it, it's irreversible. You cannot take that information back. And lastly, communication is a learned skill. It's like playing basketball. It's like hitting a tennis ball. You can improve on your communication skills. With that said, let's get started and look at the communication process. Okay, so looking at this model of a communication process, a very simple model, I want to put some humanistic terms to this, or kind of bring this to life a little bit with this form. So we have our source. The source is the person that initiates the communication, and then we have the receiver, the person who will interpret the message when the source initiates the communication. But I want to put personalities to these two folks. Our source is a happy-go-lucky, optimistic person. Our receiver is a pessimist, is someone who is just always negative. So you have two extreme opposites. So you think about this when you're communicating with someone and you know the other person is an extreme opposite. So that we have personalities, and we're going to put this into play in a few minutes. So looking at the process, the source initiates the communication. He or she will obviously generate ideas of what he or she wants to say, to communicate. And these ideas are encoded. Encoded, in other words, transforming these ideas into symbols. It's not just words, but it's symbols. So obviously we know nonverbal communication, facial expressions, transforming what they want to communicate into words, into nonverbal communication. It travels on a channel. Okay, that's how it gets there. And, obviously this is the message. Now this channel can be many things. In the business world, in the workplace, a lot of times it's mediated communication. Mediated communication being via email or a text message, or maybe something like what we're doing with our online class. Or it could be in person, or it could be on the telephone. But it's a channel, the way that the communication is transformed. Now, not to confuse things here, but a lot of times we do have to think about when we want to communicate, how or what channel are we going to use? I mean, is this a really important message? Should I go see the person face to face? Or is this a type of message I could just text? Or is it a type of message that I can send via email? So that's all part of the communication in itself as well. I mean, have you ever broken up with your significant other via text? Not a good idea, right? That deserves a face-to-face communication. Okay, so channel. So the communication travels on the channel, and the receiver, when he or she interprets this information, he or she decodes. In other words, depending on who this person is, what the makeup of this person is, this receiver, they will interpret, they will decode these symbols in a certain way. And then that receiver will provide feedback. Okay? In other words, we'll respond to the source, and then we see how the process takes place, how the communication will then be pinpointed, hopefully to the intended message of the source to the receiver, and vice versa. So a couple things. I said this person's happy-go-lucky, the source, and the receiver is a pessimist. So, do you think based on the receiver's personality, he or she will interpret messages a certain way based on being negative, always kind of looking at, the glass is half empty, compared to the way someone who may be an optimist in the way he or she would interpret the message? Other things that come into effect, is context of the communication. Context is, where is this taking place? Okay, is this Friday night at the club with your friends? The context is happy-go-lucky, or is it in a serious meeting at work with the board of directors? We know in that context, in each of those contexts, you'll use certain language. You'd have certain formality, okay, and you would want to communicate, encode a certain way, and you would also decode in a certain way. Context can also mean psychological context. Is the person who's receiving the information just not feeling well today, or just not up for listening to what you have to say? Or perhaps it's based on historical context, which is maybe you talked to this person last week and it wasn't very good. It wasn't a very successful communication process. If anything, maybe you had some angry words. So this receiver is going to interpret these words or the message in a certain way, perhaps, or come in with certain perceptions based on this historical context that took place. We see the importance of listening, effective listening, as you are communicating, encoding, decoding, and receiving, and providing clear feedback to the source. Because as we know, if you're not listening, you're not interpreting correctly. And the importance of providing feedback of saying, for instance, if the source told the receiver, I would like to have that report due by Wednesday, December 1st, and the receiver provides feedback in a way of reiterating that he or she thoroughly understood this information. Okay, so you want the report back by December 1st? No problem. And in that way, the communication process is complete. So you see how important it is to provide this feedback to the source, especially in a situation like that. Lastly, I do want to mention again the importance of feedback. Have you ever said something to someone, sent an email to someone, and you received no response? How do we interpret that? We can't. The communication, is it successful? Well, not what you intended it to be successful for. So it's real important to provide some type of feedback, especially in a workplace. If you receive an email, even if it's a simple thanks, got it, that way the source knows that you as the receiver received the information. Okay, so in a nutshell, communication process. We start with the source. Okay, the source initiates the communication. The source, depending on who he or she is, right? The makeup of the person, optimistic, religious, environmentalist, or whatever. Those things do come into play. How you formulate your ideas. You encode these ideas. You come up with your carefully crafted words or your message that you write. You send it on an appropriate channel. Okay, depending on what the communication is, you think about, okay, what's the best way, the best channel I can use? The receiver will interpret, decode this information, and decode the symbols that are being sent, and then he or she will provide feedback so we know that the message was received and that feedback is provided at that time. A couple things, too, I want you to remember is that whenever you are communicating, always think about to whom am I communicating to? Who is this person? What's the best way I can communicate to transfer my message to this person? Based on context, based on knowing that personality, based on, okay, what channel should I use for this particular person, for this receiver, so the receiver understands your particular message.